Welcome back to Justice Redesign. I'm Steve Teskey, retired judge, and today we're doing something I didn't expect to do quite this soon. We are stress testing the theory. You see, in our last episode, Beyond the Business Case, we said DEI isn't a slogan, it's an equation. There are three variables, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion, and each one operates independently. And we said something very specific. Inclusion is the driving variable, and it's what an organization does. Diversity is what follows, and equity is what stabilizes. And we also said something else. What we said was that when political pressure rises, companies won't necessarily dismantle architecture. No. What they're going to do is they're going to retreat from language. And almost on cue, enter Goldman Sachs. Steps forward. And here's what happened. Goldman announced it will no longer explicitly consider race, gender, or sexual orientation when evaluating potential board members. Now, let's pause for a moment before we jump to conclusions here. Did they say diverse boards are bad for governance? No. Did they release data showing diversity hurt performance? No. Did they renounce everything they previously said about the benefits of varied perspectives? Diversity? No. They removed explicit criteria. Now, folks, that's not the same thing as abandoning inclusion. That's exposure management. You see, here's the part that gets lost in the headline. Goldman Sachs still has a page on its own website titled Diversity and Inclusion. Not merit only. Not, we're done with this. No, it's titled Diversity and Inclusion. And on that page, Goldman says the diversity of its workforce, including diversity of perspectives, enhances its performance-based culture. It says excellence requires drawing the best people from the broadest pool of applicants. It says teams excel when people operate in an inclusive environment that welcomes differences and encourages input from all perspectives. So let's be precise, okay? Goldman did not delete diversity and inclusion from its corporate vocabulary. It changed how explicit it would be in one legally sensitive area, and that is board member evaluation criteria. Folks, that's not the death of DEI. That is the mitigation of DEI from public target setting to risk managed governance language. The headline says retreat. The website says continuity. Let's keep going. The policy change says recalibration. That's it. But let's be clear. When we see corporate giants today apparently retreating from their DEI programs, we aren't witnessing an ideological conversion. Believe me, we're not. They haven't suddenly decided that diversity is bad for profits. They've simply changed the landscape to avoid the political and legal crossfire surrounding the acronym itself, DEI. Take Goldman Sachs as a master class in this corporate linguistic engineering. Back in 2020, amid a wave of racial justice reckonings, Goldman made a highly publicized pledge. It would not take any company public in the US or Europe unless that company's board included at least 2 diverse members. It was a rigid, explicit mandate. Now, you fast forward to early 2025, following the Supreme Court's affirmative action ruling and a subsequent wave of reverse discrimination lawsuits, the legal landscape then shifted. A federal appeals court struck down NASDAQ's board diversity rules, and corporate exposure skyrocketed. Goldman's response wasn't to abandon the hunt for global talent. No, it was to deploy the corporate lawyers. They quietly dismantled the formal mandate, explicitly citing legal developments, and scrub the rigid compliance language altogether. Now, if you look at Goldman's public-facing platform today, the diversity and inclusion webpage still exists, but the framing has undergone a fascinating mutation. The focus has pivoted heavily toward diversity of thought and ideological perspective, rather than explicit demographic or geographic targets. Why? Well, think about it. It's because diversity of thought cannot be easily targeted by a reverse discrimination lawsuit. It provides total legal immunity while allowing the firm to continue recruiting the varied, globally agile workforce it requires to win cross-border deals and manage international wealth. This is capitalism, folks, not altruism. When the good old boys network was unchallenged and profitable, corporate America ran it effectively. When demographic DEI became a powerful tool for global market capture, they rebranded around it. And now that acronym DEI carries massive litigation risk. They are absorbing the talent pipelines into standard human resource operations under the banner of talent strategy and, get this, viewpoint diversity. They aren't trapped by ideology. They are maneuvering around a legal trap. They didn't abandon the business case for diversity. They just changed the jargon to protect the bottom line. Now, you remember the term we introduced in the reverse discrimination trap? The corporate chill? Not compliance, not judicial mandate, chill. As in hesitation induced by risk perception. We said that once reverse discrimination enters the bloodstream of corporate counsel, executives stop asking, is this effective? And they start asking and said, is this defensible? That's the shift. And that's what this looks like. EEOC investigations, shareholder activism, funding leverage, litigation uncertainty. The spreadsheet didn't suddenly change, ladies and gentlemen. The political climate did. And when regulatory temperature rises, acronyms are the first thing to melt. They're the first thing to go away. Here's the nuance that keeps getting flattened. DEI is treated rhetorically as if diversity is the only variable, as if the whole enterprise is about race-based preference. But that ignores the architecture. Inclusion is about structured interviews, transparent promotion criteria, broadened candidate sourcing, retention analysis. Folks, that's governance design. When critics attack diversity mandates, they're attacking the visible variable, the optics, what they see. But they rarely grapple with the inclusion mechanisms that are underneath all that. It's easier to fight a word than a system. This moment tells us something important. We are entering what I call the era of silent inclusion. That is, less acronym, more discretion, less public target setting, more internal calibration, less moral proclamation, more fiduciary framing. If Goldman continues broad recruitment, continues valuing varied experience, continues avoiding groupthink, then the architecture remains. Nothing's really changed. Just without the headline, DEI. The question is not, did Goldman abandon DEI? The question is, did Goldman abandon inclusion systems? That answer won't be found in press releases. It'll be found in longitudinal outcomes, board composition, leadership pipelines, retention patterns, performance. As practitioners like Jenny Clark, you've heard previously in episodes of mine, have long emphasized, inclusion is not a branding exercise. It is operational discipline. Structured interviews, standardized promotion criteria, and broadened recruitment pipelines are governance tools, not ideological statements. If those systems, remain intact, the disappearance of the acronym does not signal the disappearance of merit. It signals adaptation to regulatory pressure. And this is not just my read. Alex Edmonds, a professor of finance at London Business School, examined the same Goldman move and drew an important distinction. The headline says Goldman is scrapping DEI criteria. But Edmonds points out that Goldman is removing the explicit demographic component, that is race, gender identity, ethnicity, and sexual orientation, while retaining the cognitive diversity component, diversity of viewpoints, backgrounds, and work experience. You see, folks, that's what matters, because cognitive diversity is not political theater. It is governance protection. It is how institutions widen the field of judgment before decisions become mistakes. Edmonds also emphasizes that equity and inclusion remain connected to board culture, where their directors can speak up, challenge one another, and avoid groupthink. That is the era of silent inclusion in one sentence. The acronym retreats from the battlefield, but the architecture survives inside the business case. In other words, Goldman may be changing the vocabulary, but the business logic still remains. Now, think about this for a moment. Markets don't reward political value, right? They reward results. If inclusion improves performance, it survives. If it doesn't, it disappears. Not because cable news wins, but because the spreadsheet does. Now, this moment doesn't weaken the DEI argument. It strengthens the architecture argument. Branding is vulnerable. Architecture is durable. You could challenge quotas in court. You could pressure explicit demographic thresholds. But it's much harder to dismantle bias-resistant hiring systems, structured evaluation frameworks, promotion audits, retention, and analytics. That's engineering. And engineering doesn't vanish because language shifts. Goldman Sachs did not give us a funeral for inclusion. It gave us a field test. The acronym moved into the shadows, right? DEI. The architecture may still be doing the work. And if Alex Edmonds is right, what survived is not the slogan, but the business case beneath the slogan. That is cognitive diversity, board culture, challenge, and the avoidance of groupthink. That's the distinction critics keep missing. They think if the acronym retreats, the idea has surrendered. But institutions do not survive by chanting acronyms. They survive by solving problems. They survive by identifying talent. They survive by avoiding blind spots. They survive by making better decisions before bad decisions become very expensive ones. So the better question is not, did Goldman abandon DEI? No, the better question is, did Goldman abandon the inclusion systems that protect performance, challenge groupthink, and widen decision-making capacity? That's the real test, and that test takes time. So let's be clear. Goldman didn't suddenly discover that diverse boards weaken governance. It recalibrated legal exposure. That's not ideological surrender, that's risk management. The deeper test is this: if inclusion is merely optics, it will fade. Now, if inclusion protects challenge, reduces waste, and strengthens decision-making, folks, it's going to persist. That's a matter of capitalism, right? Profit, profit, profit. You don't sacrifice profit for ideology. Now, maybe under a different name, maybe without a press release, maybe without a department title, but performance has a stubborn habit of surviving politics. Believe me. The acronym may retreat, the architecture remains, and over time, the spreadsheet will tell the truth. Now, what we're watching in corporate America is not happening in isolation, ladies and gentlemen. The same narrative that pressures boardrooms is reshaping how we talk about civil rights altogether. When inclusion is reframed as discrimination, when reform is labeled favoritism, when historical correction is recast as present-day oppression, we're not just debating hiring policy anymore. We're redefining equality itself. In the next episode, we step back from the boardroom and examine how civil rights got turned upside down and why that inversion may matter more than any single corporate decision. Because once the language of justice is inverted, the consequences don't stay confined to business. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me on this. And until the next episode, be safe and take care. Goodbye.